All right, thanks for coming, everyone. I did a little research, and I found out that the oil companies are not as strong as we thought they were. It turns out their percentage of the gross national product is in the neighborhood of 2.5%. So you ask yourself, why are they pushing us around, including obviously the government and by extension the whole world? It's hard to answer that question, but the point is they can be defeated. There's any number of strategies that are available, which is one reason that I set up this meeting. But certainly one possibility is we live here in Silicon Valley. Google, Facebook, any number of other tech companies, including in Seattle, have got more financial muscle, more credibility, more spare cash than all of the oil companies put together. Should we be able to persuade them to make the decision to change our course, and enough of them are aware of where we stand to where they could execute that, that's one possibility. That remains to be explored. We don't know if by temperament or inclination they're going to be prepared to do that. But we're here to talk about solutions, and that's the first thing I wanted to mention. But that gets back to the other thing I wanted to discuss, which is our problem with the media. I think all of us have learned U.S. media is not reformable. It's one thing to say, oh yeah, you can get news on YouTube and on the internet and so on. But in the real world of American public opinion, particularly American politics, that's not what occurs in rural and more remote areas. People get their news from television. They have no idea about the key truths of climate science and what we're facing. And we need to achieve a breakthrough there. I'm certainly welcome to any number of suggestions on that front. But one thing that I would like to see, and Richard Pauly actually steered me in a better direction in that department. I was a little bit too ambitious, and I said, well, since there is likely to be money available to execute this, why not start a new media company? But that might not be practical because Richard informed me the cable companies and the media companies now no longer believe in cable television or traditional media. Given that we're in a transition period to YouTube and other platforms, it's a relatively economical opportunity for somebody with funds, commitment, and people like yourself to make it happen, to form a media company to communicate to the American public directly through YouTube, and a YouTube channel created where anybody can access it from their computer, including in the rural areas. So in 5 minutes or 4 minutes, obviously that's going to take some time to work out the bones of it, but I certainly welcome suggestions and details from everybody in the audience. The other thing I wanted to mention is we've seen what's happened when we've observed the political and economic forces that have taken control of this country. And we've discussed this among ourselves. Educated people are very aware of what's going on. But remember, Hitler only had 40% of the German public.
Not even.
Not even. Okay. So that being the case, we need to develop strategies to not only reach these people, but to target those who have been misleading them all this time. Obviously, that includes Koch Industries, ExxonMobil, their trade groups, who have been telling bald-faced lies and openly bribing politicians. People have a sense of that, which is why they went for what they saw at the time was a different kind of candidate in Trump, and for that matter, Bernie Sanders. But we have failed in communicating that to them. It's not the people in this room's responsibility. But we're certainly open to any kinds of suggestions or input from other sources, which I think are likely to come out of this meeting. But one thing that's been my hobby horse for quite a while, Randy Hayes is one of my oldest and dearest friends who started Rainforest Action Network. He brought 4 major corporations to their knees in the heyday of Rainforest Action Network. And that was in the form of major concessions from companies like Home Depot, Citibank, in terms of their buying practices, where they did business, how they did business. And maybe he can explain it better than I did, but he's the only one I know who had actually victories without compromise. And we need to get that state of mind now and learn from Randy about how to do it in this new environment we're in. I don't quite know how to do it, but some of you might know I worked for quite a few years trying to, I'm a children of Confederates. I believe in lost causes, and my lost cause was stopping to build out of 2x4s and build out of light gauge steel, which was similar in cost. It would last for 600 years instead of 60 years. It was straight, it didn't leak. Most of the content was recycled, and I spent a lot of time on that, writing articles, going before congressional committees. pressuring various peoples. It didn't get anywhere. So I learned a lot in that exercise. And that is that the best technology does not always win. The best solutions do not always win. We need to think of communicating strategies and also attacking subsidies and uneconomic, destructive industries. There are a lot of alternatives available there in addition to product boycotts. But Coke is certainly a rich target. They have a division called Georgia Pacific, which is similar to their fossil fuel operations in that they pollute streams and rivers habitually. They locate them in low-income areas, and the same is true of their refineries. They're essentially a criminal organization, and it would not be that difficult with a strong media campaign to call them to account and say, maybe we shouldn't buy that fluffy toilet paper that comes from the northern boreal forest of Canada, mostly old growth. Maybe we shouldn't buy formaldehyde, this plywood, an oriented strand board, that's produced in China, and even China won't even use that stuff. Formaldehyde is toxic, it outgasses. They make it over there and ship it to us. There's many other examples where the American public are not aware of the level of pollution and destruction that's occurring on the part of the private sector in the U.S. Other countries certainly are. But I certainly welcome your ideas and suggestions on an ongoing basis when it comes to things like that. The other thing I wanted to bring up was meat consumption, and in addition to fossil fuel, or excuse me, in addition to fiber and paper and lumber consumption. And in this area, I'm going to defer to my friend Sailesh Rao, who's been to the COP conferences, he's met the Pope, and he has very clear data, including in Cowspiracy, the movie he helped make happen, to go into detail there. So I'm done, and I look forward to hearing the next speaker.
My name is Scott Mandia. What I'm going to do is I'm going to continue doing what I've been doing. And how many of you have heard of the Climate Science Rapid Response Team? Okay, I co-founded that group. How many have heard of the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund? Co-founded that group. So the Climate Science Rapid Response Team, we have 160 of the world's top climate scientists. Several are in the room right now. We're going to continue to make sure that our elected officials and the press get accurate science information. But one of the new initiatives, we're working with a group called Climate Feedback, and we're going to see if we can work with Facebook and Google so they can essentially tag stories as being real or fake, and they'll rank them higher. So that's something we're working on right now, and we're very hopeful on that. And of course, the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, literally in the last month, our mission changed. We're still going to educate scientists about best practices. I have a couple of pamphlets we just produced for scientists when they, get a subpoena or hate mail or whatnot. Here's what you need to do. Basically, the first thing is take a deep breath, don't freak out. But we have several initiatives there, and I left some business cards up here. If you can think of any possible way you can support our organization, it would be very helpful, because unfortunately, I think we're going to be needed much more so in the next year or two than we were before. So then again, thank you very much for inviting me to this group.
You beat it.
So,
You can have
thanks.
a couple of questions.
I feel like I'm, being grilled. Yes.
Thank you for your efforts in Google. I get a lot of news from Google, and I like their platform for filtering news and getting just the subjects you want, and excluding the denialist propaganda sites. They are stopping that format, so you can't do that. Now, I tried to find out how they're changing that, so I look forward to what you learn, and I'll share with you what I have too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Are you a 501c3?
The Legal Defense Fund is an official 501c3.
Excellent.
Yeah. Basically, I'm like you folks. I teach full-time, by the way, to community college. I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I saw a need for action on climate change. And when I saw Mike Mann basically being taken down, I used my eBay PayPal account to start it. The IRS got involved, and I realized that's probably not the right way to do things. So we're actually now a real 501c3 doing things the right way. So, yeah. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ed Maybach. I'm with the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. And the good news that I have is that we released a poll today, our latest Climate Change in the American Mind survey report, and it confirmed my instinct. My instinct is that the election that we have just survived was not an election about climate change. It was an election about change, but it had nothing to do with climate change. There is strong, incredibly strong public action, public support for for climate action. In this report that we released today, only brought one copy tonight, happy to leave it behind. We found that 7 out of 10 Americans support the U.S. staying in and meeting our obligations in the Paris COP21 agreement, that 2 out of 3 Americans would say that we should be doing that regardless of what other countries do. It's the upside of American exceptionalism. This is something we should be doing. 6 out of 10 Americans or more would like to see Mr. Trump and the next Congress do more than has been done about climate change. 7 out of 10 Americans would like to see corporations do more than they have done to address climate change. And this is the most exciting finding from this survey. 8 out of 10 Americans say we explained in very simple, clear terms that governments have 2 basic options for reducing global warming pollution. They can either regulate it or they can tax it. And we ask our respondents, which of those 2, if any, would you prefer to see our country do? 8 out of 10 Americans say they would like to see one or the other. 5 out of 10 Americans say they would like to see our nation do both. Only 1 out of 10 said neither, and 1 out of 10 was essentially undecided. So really strong public support for climate action. That's waiting to be tapped. On the other hand, there is unequivocally a silence, a climate silence in America today. The average American, while concerned about climate change, rarely, if ever, talks about it. And the reason they don't talk about it is because they think they are in the minority. They think that either raving lunatics, frankly, on one side of the issue or the other, are the norm, and they, an average concerned American, are an exception in a very small minority. So what I think we have the opportunity to do, and Mr. Trump certainly gives every indication of overplaying his hand. As he overplays his hand, I think it creates an opportunity to teach Americans that no, you are in fact the norm. You are in very good company. Most Americans are just like you. They're worried about climate change. They would like to see their nation do the right thing to address climate change. And so, really what we have to do is find a way to break that silence, to start climate conversations, to make people feel comfortable in talking about it, because we don't solve problems we're unwilling to talk about. I know all of you have fabulous ideas about how to do that. I'm convinced that now is exactly our moment to do that. We found, not in our most current survey, but in a survey that we released in the spring, we found that essentially 1 out of 3 Americans say that they would be willing to join a campaign to force our government to respond to climate change. 1 out of 3 adults, give or take 90 or 100 million Americans out there. You add up the total number of Americans who've participated with Rainforest Action Network and Sierra Club and NRDC and all of the wonderful civic environmental organizations in America, it does not add up to 90 million, meaning there are a lot more people who I think will respond if we can find a way to ask them to do so. So thank you for your attention.
I'm Dan Miller. I'll give the 30 seconds on what I do. I do clean tech venture capital. We invest in things like carbon capture, energy storage, water. Those are like fundamental technologies that we need to go forward. I also give talks on fee and dividend, and I'll just throw it out there. Best way to put a price on carbon is fee and dividend. Everyone would love it. They do it in Alaska for different reasons. Everyone loves it there, including Sarah Palin. So we can talk about carbon pricing. I also want to talk about the fact that there is a possible silver lining to Trump winning the election. Because if Hillary won the election, people would have thought something's happening about climate. But nothing's happening about climate. Nothing happened under Clinton, nothing happened under Bush, nothing happened under Obama. He did a few good things, but he also increased fossil fuel production more than any other president in history and was proud of it. So that's what, and the climate doesn't care what you say or do. It only cares what you put in the atmosphere. And it's really far gone. People have no idea how far gone it is. And the climate scientists would do a great job, or a little cautious about telling you about how far gone it is. But, a few things like last time it was 400 parts per million like it is today. Sea levels were 75 feet higher than today. I think there's almost no chance we're going to avoid 2 degrees. We're worried about, are we going to avoid 4 degrees, which climate scientist Kevin Anderson said is not compatible with an organized global community. So that's the bad news, and it's really bad, okay? But the good news is that if Hillary won, everyone would have thought something was happening. And then we get the statistics like we just heard, that very large percentage of Americans want to do something about climate and they want someone else to do something about climate. And nothing happens. So what we need is something like the Tea Party. We need people that are crazy, fanatical, will vote out Democrats that aren't strong enough on climate. And that's how you get political power. And you don't need a lot of them. You need like 10%, to be crazy about this thing. Well, with Hillary, everyone had thought Hillary was doing something. But she's, chances are she wouldn't have done. I mean, we're not even talking about what's really necessary to do. Increasing solar, great, all the stuff, but it's not making the kind of dent of getting down to zero emissions by 2050, right? And then negative emissions after that. But with Trump there, everyone's going to know that no one's doing anything about it. And so for the first time, so now when he says, well, it was a Chinese hoax or something, now the press can come back and interview Ben and that's bullshit. And then the people will rise up and maybe get what's really necessary, which is an army of people who are fanatically dedicated to solving the problem. And I think I'm not guaranteeing this, I'm just saying that the situation is sort of there. If we can turn that, if we can use a little jujitsu of taking this negative thing and flipping it back into real, dedicated, crazy action on climate. And again, the answer is we know all we need to know about climate, we know the solutions, and everyone would love them. And it's absolutely insane that we're not doing anything about it. But that's because people just are not engaged to the extent they need to. And I'll just do a little plug for a book that talks all about this kind of thing, which is Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change by George Marshall. I helped him edit the book. And it's all not about climate change, but how we think about climate change and why it's so hard to get people engaged. And it is really hard. This is a diabolical problem designed by some mastermind to make sure we don't act in time. So anyway, if we can just get people together and really, really get a small army of people really dedicated to doing something, then I think we actually have a shot at it. And we'll have cool technologies ready to go when we put the right incentives in place. Thanks.
I got to pick up on that because it's sort of relevant to what I've been trying to say here, and that is that we can do everything we want to do, what we think we want to do, clean energy and whatever, and it's not going to make a damn bit of difference if we don't go ahead and get the drivers behind this under control. And that's basically population levels, sustainable population levels. I think that one sweet spot, and I'm constantly looking because I'm constantly going over the literature of emerging news on these issues all the time as part of a job as doing a weekly column at the Huffington Post on climate change. I'm constantly in search of sweet spots, places where people haven't been looking very carefully. One of the sweet spots, of course, in energy has been energy efficiency. But where are the other sweet spots beyond what we're looking at? And one of them, in population at least, is preventing unintended pregnancies. And it's really a very nice sweet spot. We've got a lot of organizations who have been putting in place technology and a little bit of the message, but they need a lot more in terms of marketing and outreach, and it's not there yet. And we could be doing so much more, and that's even starting in places. Iowa, Colorado, both have programs for preventing unintended pregnancies. Iowa's was started with an independent donor. One donor went ahead and jump-started the program. If we could develop a network of people, big donors, in terms of going ahead and going throughout the country, forget it. Bypass Congress, the politics, because it's not going to happen. But go ahead and go state by state and local and show that, in fact, just like these states can now show, you can save millions as well as help women and make them safe. And by the way, start bringing our populations down to a more sustainable level, then we've got a shot at this.
Only about 16% of Americans believe climate change is an urgent problem. And when you interview people and you ask them what issues they think are important, climate change comes out 19th, 20th, consistently all the time. So imagine, the most urgent problem humanity has ever faced is not viewed as an urgent problem by Americans. Sure, they support clean energy, et cetera, who wouldn't? There is no urgency for an urgent situation. And it's not surprising because the other side, they come out of business school and they understand how the brain actually works. And they are marketing geniuses. And the first principle of marketing is have a simple message, make America great again, and repeat it, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it till you're sick to death of it, and only then have you begun to get into people's heads. And what you do is you scientifically assure that your simple messages will reach your target audiences repetitively. Marketers actually buy a certain amount of reach. They can tell you, I know that my message will be seen by this target audience this many times. We don't do that. What's our message on climate change? The Tower of Babel. Who are our spokespeople who are well known? Go out and ask in the street. Gore's the only answer you'll get. Gore's terrific. He's not enough and he doesn't work for everybody. So we have no scientific, focused communications operation to raise that number. How ridiculous is that? We're a wealthy movement. But the money goes to do all sorts of other things rather than affect the public opinion environment scientifically and systematically. We certainly could do it. It's not even that complicated. But we have no such program. I'll give you an example. So a lot of the nation's views about this issue filter down from the Washington, D.C. bubble, where the press is and the Congress and the think tanks, et cetera. So you turn on television in Washington, D.C., and what you will see is how great oil, coal, and gas are. You're going to be energy independent, rich, tons of jobs, and lots of beautiful women. What will you essentially never see on television in Washington, D.C. is the consequences of using all that stuff. The naval bases underwater, the national ball underwater, refugees pouring in from all over the world, the price of food going crazy, the economy ruined. Invisible. We are invisible. And we have this kind of basic theory of communications in the climate movement and much of the public interest movement. I call it the telepathic theory of communications. We think because we know something, magically, everybody finds out about it. Now, the interesting thing about the Washington, D.C. media bubble is everybody says, oh, woe is me. We can't afford to match those evil fossil fuel companies in buying television time. Well, how much do you think it costs to buy one 30-second television ad on Fox News or CNN in the Washington, D.C. media market? Any guesses? How much for one ad on CNN or Fox in Washington, D.C.? Do I have any guesses?
Just a few $100.
Okay, that's the normal answer, about $50,000 to $100,000, and the answer is $500. It's $500.
Per showing?
Yeah. So the reason, now you would never do one ad that doesn't do anything unless you're causing a giant controversy, and we've done that. But we can afford this, so the reason we don't do things like this is not because of money, it's because we don't think this way. We come out of the sciences, the law, the humanities, academia, and we have this quaint notion that you tell people something once that's smart, and a light bulb goes off in their head and everything changes. People who've had to sell products and services know it doesn't work that way. You've just had a great example of it. So until we penetrate certain audiences repetitively with simple messages that are accurate, by the way, I'm not for using any inaccurate messages, we don't have to. Until we devise a strategy to bring tons of repetition of these thoughts to these audiences by tons of means, most of which are not expensive. Social media is not expensive. We have no organized effort, even to use celebrity outreach on social media on climate. We are focused on everything else. Until we change that, we will not raise that number. And Trump and the rest of the people will say, oh, look at the numbers, people don't care. I rest my case.
So I wanted to talk to you about, for 4 minutes, about 4 different things. So I brought 4 different props to help me. So 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Carbon Dharma, The Occupation of Butterflies. And this was about what we need to do to address climate change. And I think pretty much we all know what we need to do. But the idea I had here was that it had to be a story that people could buy into, that everyone should be able to buy into, that doesn't send anyone on a guilt trip. And the story I came up with was the story of the caterpillar and the butterfly. That we are in a caterpillar phase where we are consuming like crazy. And now we are 60% larger than what the planet can support. So which means that the caterpillar has time now to change, to transform. So as part of that, so this was easy. What do you need to do? It's fairly easy. Then we co-produced a movie called Cowspiracy, The Sustainability Secret. It's because we discovered that we were running into problems, that there was a systemic problem that prevents people from talking about it, from doing anything about it. It's systemic. It's built into the system. Because you see, we are fundamentally in a system that's oriented towards growth, and that's based on consumption as an organizing value and competition as an organizing principle. It's a system that's perfect for the caterpillar. But the caterpillar system has no way of knowing how to transform into the butterfly or into the chrysalis, for that matter. Okay? So then this year, I released this book called Carbon Yoga. So Dharma is what is the right thing to do. Yoga is how do you go about doing it. So how do you tell a story that can convince people to change? And the subtitle of this is The Vegan Metamorphosis. Because one of the things that we know we can do is change our relationship with nature, change our relationship with other life forms. Because I tell people that as far as the animals are concerned, there are 7 billion Donald Trumps on the planet, okay, who are grabbing things whenever they want, you know. So I gave a talk at a school in Marrakesh, thanks to Linda. And in the talk, I asked the kids 3 questions. There were 200 kids from 6th grade to 11th grade there, and they were amazing kids, by the way. So the first question I asked them was, how many of you are vegan? And one child raised his hand. And you could tell that he was usually picked upon. Okay? Then I asked the kids, how many of you would deliberately hurt an innocent animal unnecessarily? And no one raised their hands. So I said, by definition, all of you are vegan, except who you are and what you do are not in alignment, which means you're suffering, actually. You're all suffering. And the reason you said you would never hurt an innocent animal unnecessarily is because you have compassion at your core. You were made in the image of God. That's why you have compassion at your core. So essentially at that point, I had their attention. Okay? So the third question I asked is a question about the weightlifter. So imagine a weightlifter who is lifting 5 times his weight above his head, discovers that he's on quicksand and that he's sinking. He knows that his weight alone is too much for the quicksand to bear. What is the first thing he should do? And everyone said, drop the weight, of course. And I told them, the weight of all human beings on the planet, 7.4 billion of us, is about 500 million metric tons, which is more than the 200 million metric tons that was the weight of all wild megafauna from 10,000 years ago. So our weight alone is too much for the planet to bear. But our livestock eat 5 times as much food as we do. Should we not drop that first? So I think there were a lot of kids who are going to go home and tell their parents that they're going to go vegan. Okay? So hopefully that happens. And I wanted to show you my 4th prop. It's a project we are working on called the Sacred Lifeline Project. And the idea is, if our problem is systemic, and the system does not want to change, isn't it because there is no alternate that it can look at and say that's where we all need to go to? So the idea behind this Sacred Lifeline project is to create a community where we actually live like we are in the chrysalis, where we restrict our overall footprint to at most half the earth, so the other half can be given back to wildlife, to regenerate forests, to bring back, to sequester carbon on the ground in the form of recovering forests. And we close the loop. We close the loop on all our cycles as much as possible. So it's going to be a zero-waste community, sustainable and off-grid, and of course it's going to be vegan, and all faiths, so that all the faiths of the world can come together, because every faith of the world does say that compassion for all creation is at their very core. So thank you very much.
Well, my old career was flying into hurricanes. I did 4 years of research down in Miami where I'd go fly into hurricanes, including a couple Category 5 hurricanes. And after almost getting killed in a Category 5 hurricane, I decided that maybe I should go back and get my PhD. I went back to the University of Michigan in the early 90s and did that, specializing in air pollution, and founded this crazy company called Weather Underground. And now I'm a blogger for them. And that started about 20 years ago. And my blog is very popular, read by a lot of people. We get several million unique page views or unique users per month. And it's not just me anymore. It's now called Category 6, so I share that blog with Bob Henson. And this provides a platform for guest bloggers, potentially. So if you have an issue that you want to get in front of a lot of people, I can do that. Mostly I talk about extreme weather, but I talk about climate change quite a bit, too. My next post is going to be actually on the rally that was down there at Moscone Center today, the Stand Up for Science rally. A little background, though, my company got bought by the Weather Channel 3 years ago, so I don't run Weather Underground anymore like I used to. And then just this year, IBM bought the internet side of the Weather Channel and split it. So now there's the cable channel off on its own, and the internet portion of the Weather Channel, along with Weather Underground, is now owned by IBM. And the CEO of IBM, I found out today, is now on Trump's board of economic advisors, one of the 10 people advising Trump, which may be a good thing. I don't think she's a climate denier. Anyway, I've not been, told to slow down what I say. I still am free to talk about climate change and politics and where we need to go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the science as I see it. There aren't many people more in tune with our climate and how it's changing and how it's impacting extreme weather than I am. Blogging about it every day since 2005 has really tuned me in, plus my background with working with hurricanes and extreme weather and air pollution and so on. And ever since 2010, that was when I see that we really shifted to a higher octave, a new gear in the climate. The number of billion-dollar disasters that year was a record level, 41. This year we had $29 billion disasters, so not quite as many, but ever since 2010, the number of billion-dollar disasters has been a lot higher than we're used to seeing. And this year, our most expensive billion-dollar disaster we had was in China. They had a flood, $28 billion. That was the third most expensive billion-dollar disaster in world history, not in the U.S. The U.S. has got, 8 or 9 more than that. Also this year, we had... I talk about these billion-dollar disasters, but the most expensive disaster was one that you can't really catalog, at least if you're an insurance firm, air pollution. Air pollution is estimated to cause multiple trillions of dollars of damage each year, maybe as much as 20 trillion, and that's something we really need to communicate to people. The side effect of cutting down our carbon emissions is to save trillions of dollars, and 4 to 7 million deaths per year, premature deaths, are caused by air pollution. So one of the positive messages we can really be putting out there is this side benefit of controlling emissions is to reduce air pollution, which is incredibly destructive. So that's a kind of message I try and get out in my blog. The other thing I'm really concerned about, and we need to get the message out more, is drought is our number one enemy. I mean, we look at extreme weather. I blog about hurricanes all the time because that gets attention. I mean, it gets page views and it's good for business. But really, drought is what's going to kill us. I did a blog this year where I talked about 10 civilizations in the past that have fallen because of drought. The Egyptians, the pyramid builders, they crashed because of drought. I mean, we know about the Mayans, they crashed because of drought. That's really where we need to be focusing the attention. I estimate probably a 1% chance each year that we're going to suffer multiple extreme weather events worldwide that will affect food baskets, that will cause a cascade shock to the food supply system of the world, that will cause maybe a depression or certainly a severe recession, and those odds are going up each year. If you sum up 1% per year and maybe you double those odds by 20 years from now, you're talking at a probable event sometime in the next 30 years where you're going to see this multiple extreme weather sort of shock to the global food system that's going to cause a severe crisis in the global economy. Maybe we need to start thinking about what messaging we need to put in place when that event's going to happen, because it will happen. Maybe we should think about what's going to happen, what messaging we should do when Arctic sea ice finally melts away from the North Pole, which almost happened this year. That event is coming. So a lot of opportunities for both positive and negative messaging with regards to extreme weather. And yeah, I invite you to think about, maybe what should I be blogging about? Come to me. I'm happy to take ideas and suggestions, and potentially guest blogs as well. So that's my piece.
So I wanted to talk about misinformation and denial, which is really the dark underbelly of climate communication. And we really ignore that at our own peril. What the psychological research tells us is even if we get our climate communication perfect and craft it and fine-tune it, all that, the positive effect from that communication can be cancelled out by a virulent myth. And so it's not like good communication is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We also need to address misinformation and inoculate people against it. So I founded Skeptical Science around a decade ago, and the purpose of it was quite simple. It was just debunking misinformation with peer-reviewed science. Over that decade, we've built up a network of scientists and lay people all around the world who all, I guess, what brings them together is a passion for climate communication and making a difference. Over that time, I also became aware of the psychological research into climate communication and learning things and really designing our communication based on that research. A good example is Ed's research finding that what people thought about the scientific consensus is a gateway belief, and it influences a whole range of climate attitudes, including support for policy. And so based on that, we did an analysis of climate papers, found 97% consensus amongst relevant climate papers. And when we published that, that got a lot of attention. President Obama featured it. Prime Minister David Cameron talked about it. But with all that attention, also a lot of negative attention came. Ted Cruz, Sarah Palin, Lamar Smith, Dana Rohrabacher have all attacked our research. And what we were doing is trying to close that consensus gap, the gap between what the public think and the 97%. And slowly it has been, but surely it has been improving. Now, next month, I'm moving to George Mason University in Virginia. I start my job almost exactly the same time that Trump starts his new job. And I don't know if that's coincidence or fate. I feel like I'm kind of being parachuted in at the time when we're really, it feels like we're possibly entering a golden age of misinformation on climate change, or a dark age probably is a better metaphor. And what we need is we really need to up our game in terms of researching what are the most virulent myths that need combating, what are the most effective ways of combating them, and what are the most effective ways to deploy communication strategies. And I think what David said really resonated. The key golden rule of debunking is fight sticky, simple myths with simpler, stickier facts, and be persistent in communicating them. And I think that on that principle and really working hard to research and develop strategies, I think that's key over the next 4 years. So, thank you.
So, as Mike said, I'm an ecologist. I study climate ecosystem interactions, and in particular, the feedbacks that arise as climate heats ecosystems. Ecosystems change in response, and those changing ecosystems feed back to make the climate problem worse. And some of you may have seen an article that I and 40 other authors all co-authored. It came out in Nature last week. It got a lot of press on soil carbon emissions as a result of heating soil, causing carbon to flow from the soil to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The article actually underestimated, because when you put 40 scientists together, they're going to reach a common denominator that in many cases, including this, is reaching a conclusion that is not as dire as many of us thought was scientifically warranted. But what I want to do is actually not continue with that theme, but rather I would like you for the moment to imagine that global climate science was wrong and that global warming is not a problem. Just suppose. I don't believe that. I am firmly convinced that it is a major problem and poses an existential threat to humanity. But what I want to point out is that there are many other existential threats to humanity: lethal pandemics, toxification, the breakdown of governance, which I think we're seeing signs of throughout the Western world now. And I want to go back to somebody raised, I think you had raised the point about even if climate science were wrong, there's all this air pollution and we would reduce it if we switched from fossil fuel to renewable. And this is an example of what we used to call the no regrets argument. The no regrets argument said, even if climate science were wrong, and none of us think it is wrong, but even if it were wrong, we should be doing more efficiency in energy use. We should be transitioning as rapidly as we can from fossil fuels to solar and wind. And the reason is that we would accrue, as a result of doing that, enormous numbers of other benefits. Ending mountaintop removal, reducing acid rain, reducing smog in the cities, and the list goes on and on. The other thing I want to say is that this issue about drought that Jeff raised, we are going to have somewhere between 9 and 10 or 11 billion people on the planet if current trends are extrapolatable to over the next 70 years. And what I would point out, and this has been well documented, is that if you look historically at droughts that have ended dynasties and civilizations like the Mayan, in a world, those same droughts, which were not caused by fossil fuel burning, those same droughts in a world with 10 billion people would very likely cause billions of deaths and pose an existential threat to humanity. So if we don't deal with the population problem, even if climate science is wrong, we will end up with a catastrophe, civilization-changing events. So I would, much as I care about climate, I want to just emphasize this point, that population matters, lethal pandemics matter, toxicity matters, the governance matters, and all of these problems are exacerbated by population growth and by conventional, even solar energy. With enough people on the planet, the solar solution becomes impossible, and the land use effects become overwhelmingly detrimental. So we've got to deal with population as a problem. It should be front and center in everything we do and say when we talk to the public about this.
Tonight I wanted to suggest launching another sort of media campaign, but in this case, I'm thinking of it in terms of a 7-year, $100 million campaign about the entire Earth. So it plays well off of some of the earlier comments that people have been making, And so the entire planet, or the whole Earth, and that kind of a campaign would have to have a certain sort of understandable package of activities. We had 5 reasons to boycott Burger King. In this case, we're thinking of a 6-point plan, right? And this 6-point plan would be hopefully popularized year after year after year for 7 years and with a sizable budget. Though we started our 3-year national media campaign with very little money, right? We need a bit of money to make this happen. But as you know, $100 million in a global campaign over 7 years is not a lot of money. Nonetheless, we think we could do a lot with that. So that money would be spent on 5 major continents, and then we'd have one sort of unit for the islands, the major islands of the world. And we would spend the money fairly evenly each year in all of those different regions around this sort of package of 6 different things. Well, obviously in 4 minutes I can't give you too many details about that, but if you want a longer 5-page paper on it, give me your card and I'll send it to you with a lot more details. But the first point is really about promoting a true cost circular economy. And that's really about ecologizing the rules of the global economy, right? And systematically figuring out how to internalize those pesky pollution externalities. But we also really need to invent some new institutions that, say, at a continental level, ratchet down economic activity around carrying capacity levels, as well as globally. I mean, that's what cap and trade attempts to do in that one category. So point number 1 is really about changing the design of the global economic system, but popularizing that through this campaign over 7 years. Second point is about 100% renewable energy, and I don't need to say anything else about that to this crowd tonight. We know the sensibility of that. The third point is about 100% ecological farming, shifting industrial agriculture globally to agroecology. We could better feed the world, and we could capture a lot of carbon and scrub the atmosphere from that as well. The fourth point is called nature needs half. There hasn't been to this day really a serious strategy to stop the 6th great extinction, one of those other existential threats that John just mentioned to us, right? And so nature needs half is really about setting aside in protected reserves half of the planet, half of the oceans and half of the terrestrial. Now that might sound outrageous, but it is not. There's 846 ecological zones and 14 biomes, and we've studied all of them. And we know we have some sensibility on the pragmatics of that kind of a campaign. But the 5th point is biospheric literate society with low-impact lifestyles and smaller numbers. To speak to Mel's point and John's point, it's not unimportant to deal with the lower numbers, right? But biosphere literate, because if we don't have the billions of people, whatever numbers we end up with, currently with trends or post-collapse, we need to understand how the world works ecologically. And we've developed a 5-star certification system for that. And we need to see how our low-impact lifestyles fit in concert with all of us simultaneously, and we've done some work on that. The 6th category is one of my favorites. It's just simply the word other. Because no laundry list is going to speak to everybody's particular passion, and they will hammer you for what you're leaving out that they're passionate about, and fair enough. You know, as long as any other particular passions are in concert with the first 5 points, we need to have this kind of a plan malleable to around the world in different zones and different issues and adaptable, and we've thought about that. So we need a lot of positive energy in these negative times, and via this kind of a campaign, it strikes me that people will begin to understand that we must maintain what's required to sustain life on this planet, right? People get that if you help them with it. That we need to learn that we can feed the world through ecological farming, and yes, we can build vibrant, locally based, true cost circular economies, right, that are actually sophisticated economies in many respects. So this Whole Earth 6-point plan campaign looks at half of the planet used responsibly to provide dignified lives for all people, and half the planet set aside to just halt the extinction crisis and protect the planetary cycles. So you could picture this $100 million 7-year campaign as basically a sales pitch, which it is in many respects. But we've already applied for this money from the MacArthur Foundation. Many of you know about the $100 million challenge. Well, we don't expect to win it, but that's only one pot of money. That amount of money exists in other pots, and we should find it and do this. But, this is a kind of an economic and an ecological offense, because you need to have an offense to save the planet. People are going to rally to combat Trump, and that's already been spoken to tonight. And they'll likely be successful at stopping most of the really negative things, right? We did very well at stopping most of the negative things under Presidents Bush and Cheney. So remember that this campaign is in addition to existing the important climate change work that's already happening, you know. So if you're supporting Paris or shutting down coal plants or trying to eradicate, you know, the subsidies from all fossil fuels, this is just in addition and synergistic with that. So we're selling this positive vision. We want to sell it in 6 regions of the world year after year after year. We want to work with local groups who embrace the preponderance of this thing. And we think we can ecologize the economy. We can have an economic model that is in sync with the laws of nature. And that's the better world vision that will build the movement to help us move this to the better world. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Will Burns, and I'm the co-director of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment, which focuses on climate geoengineering issues, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. So my friend Dave Hawkins at NRDC has said that when we look at climate change issues, there's no such thing as a silver bullet, but there's lots of silver buckshot, and that's how I view how we address climate change. And I think one of the more potentially potent kinds of buckshot is climate litigation. I'm a law person by training, and so I just want to talk briefly of where I think in the Trump administration litigation may have a role, and the fact that we should consider, when we're looking at things to funding organizations, especially NGOs such as Earth Justice in San Francisco, that are working on climate litigation. And there's a number of these potential causes of action that are percolating and are likely to grow stronger as the Trump administration begins to mobilize and seek to destroy the edifice of climate legislation in this country and international treaties. The first of these is something we call atmospheric trust litigation. Atmospheric trust litigation is based on a Roman doctrine called the public trust doctrine that's been embraced in the United States and a lot of other countries. It's the argument that the government preserves natural resources on behalf of this generation and future generation. It has an obligation both to protect those resources in specific manners that are carved out by the courts, and perhaps as important, to repair past damages. There's been a number of public trust cases throughout the world, including in Spain, Portugal, the Philippines, et cetera, that have successfully protected public resources. The atmospheric trust doctrine seeks to extend that to the context of climate change and argues that we should view the climate as an atmospheric trust. The case that you've probably heard of the most, despite the fact there's a number of state cases, is a federal case called Juliana versus the United States. And this was brought by a group of children, grade school children through high school, with the work of a law professor at the University of Oregon. That case very recently was able to withstand a motion for summary judgment in a federal district court in Oregon, which means it is going forward, and it will argue that there is a public obligation, a federal government obligation to protect the climate, and that the federal government has a responsibility to carve out specific remedies, including reparative remedies. And I would suggest that that's the litigation that we should be supporting, for a couple of reasons. One, I think it might actually prevail. Second of all, perhaps as important, is litigation also can have a potent symbolic role. It can help us to change norms and to convey the importance of issues. When we talk about communications, the law, for better or worse, has a great cachet. And the fact here that we have children who are literally fighting for their future provides us a very potent narrative that may be one of the best narratives we have when we move forward. Another possible avenue of litigation is something called public nuisance. Quintessential case of public nuisance is when you have a polluting facility of some sort, such as a metallurgy plant that creates major damage throughout an area. Public nuisance cases have been brought in the past in terms of climate change. We did an entire book a number of years ago on this, 2005 through 2008. Most of those cases went down in flames for a couple of reasons. First of all, courts found that we didn't want to interfere with the federal government's efforts to negotiate in good faith at the international level to address climate change. And second of all, once we started in the Obama administration carving out remedies under the Clean Air Act, once the Supreme Court said that we could regulate greenhouse gases under that, courts began to argue that public nuisance was preempted by statutory remedies. That may all change in the Trump administration. First of all, we may no longer, as courts, indulge the fiction that the Trump administration is working diligently at the international level to negotiate effective climate agreements. And to that extent, we may find courts, especially before they've been packed with Trump appointees, more amenable to this kind of argument. Second of all, if the Trump administration is successful in dismantling the Clean Power Act, Clean Power Plan, which he very well may be, perhaps reversing the finding of an endangerment and thus removing federal authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, then this preemption of public nuisance actions by federal legislation will also fall to the wayside, and there'll be fertile ground for this kind of litigation. And so I would argue that one of the things that we should be looking at in terms of our financial support are organizations that are effectively waging those battles. And as I said, Earth Justice, the Center for Conservation Biology, and some others are doing that kind of work. There's other areas also we should consider funding. There's a number of causes of action right now under the National Environmental Policy Act, which mandates environmental impact statements, that is fighting federal leasing of federal land for fossil fuel development tract by tract. And one of the important things about that is it's working to hone this idea of the social cost of carbon and feeding that into the environmental impact statements. One of the things that the Trump administration has targeted is the social cost of carbon to try to discount it. Effective litigation, discovery that helps us to bolster the arguments in terms of support of the social cost of carbon will help it make it more difficult for them to do that from a statutory standpoint, also and in terms of this litigation. And then finally, the other thing I think we need to be doing is working on the Clean Power Plan litigation. 27 states have brought an action against the Clean Power Plan, our only federal efforts to address climate change. Circuit Court in D.C. is going to decide that case later this year. Invariably, either way, it's going to go to the Supreme Court, probably with a Trump appointee on it. It may be likely that that case throws out most of the Clean Power Plan. But if the Clean Air Act is still in place and it still requires federal regulation of greenhouse gases, then there's going to be a rulemaking process. And one of the things that's important for NGOs and organizations such as this is to support effective efforts to ensure that if new rules are put in place, that they do not eviscerate the kind of things that we've developed. And there's standards from a legal perspective that may limit how much damage the Trump administration can do. And we should certainly be fighting to do that. Thank you.
I wanted to make a couple of comments. We do a lot of work at the Pacific Institute. I was one of the founders of the Pacific Institute in 1987, almost 30 years ago. And the idea then, I'm an academic, I'm a climate scientist and hydrologist by training. The idea was that facts matter, that the problems we face are interdisciplinary. You're not going to solve energy problems only with technology. You need economics, you need smart social communications. You're not going to solve environmental problems in a narrow disciplinary fashion. And I think that's the reality in our complex, interconnected world. I think that still remains true today. There's been some conversation about drought. We do a lot of work at the Institute on water issues, as Mike mentioned, on drought, on the implications of drought for our complex societies. We've done a lot of work on the connections between climate change and drought and the growing influence that climate change has, for example, on the California drought. There's been a discussion that we live in a post-truth world, especially in the last year or so, when fake news has gotten a lot of attention, maybe not as much as it deserves. I believe that facts matter. I believe that science still matters. I believe there is a role for science and science communication in pushing back against this idea that we live in a post-truth world. Without a doubt, we're bombarded by not truth. We're bombarded by fake facts. We're bombarded by climate denial. And that needs to be fought against, without a doubt. But I think that activists and advocates and scientists need to stick to a truth environment. We need to push back with facts. And when there is fake news, when there is climate denial, suggestions that climate change isn't real, that climate science is bad, that climate scientists are biased, facts push back against that. And so I'm a scientist. Admittedly, I have delved occasionally into advocacy. I believe there are things that need to be done on the policy side that we need to continue to do. But when we do those things, however we choose to do them, I urge that we do them with facts. I get a little depressed sometimes when colleagues and friends on the environmental activist side tip over into not factual advocacy. And I don't think we need to do that. The facts are on our side. The science is on our side. And so as we move forward, pushing back legally, pushing back with advocacy, pushing back with campaigns, let's mobilize the science. Let's mobilize the facts. And I think that will be far more effective than the alternative. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Thank you very much. Mike.
How do we communicate the facts of the danger that we're in to the bulk of the American public?
Okay, so part of what we do at the Institute is science, and part of what we do is communications. And there are people far better at communications strategy than me. I do believe that figuring out, as David, I guess, said, the right message and how to get the right message across, and as John has done forever, the facts that push back against the bad science, those things are incredibly important and incredibly effective. And there are people in this room who have figured out key messages about consensus and about impacts on society and about what do we really care about. So when we work on drought, our argument is, look, we care about healthy agriculture. We care about healthy ecosystems. We care about safe water and sanitation. I mean, there are positive messages out there. And I think getting scientists to talk to people who are better at communications, to put together the scientifically valid information in a way that resonates is part of the challenge. And I look forward to meeting that challenge with some of the people who are here and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You know, 21 years ago, my life changed. 21 years ago, that IPCC report, the second assessment report, was published, and it came to the finding that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. And those words changed my life forever. I spent roughly 1.5 years defending that finding and the process by which it had been reached. And I learned a lot of important lessons in the process. One was, as Peter said, the importance of science, of pushing back, of telling people, this is how we understand, this is how we know, this is what the nature of the evidence is. And to me, that's so critically important, those simple messages. How do we know? How have we reached this point in human history when we know that we're not just innocent bystanders, we're active participants in the climate system? What's the nature of the evidence? To tell those stories again and again and again and shove the science in people's faces. Another valuable lesson was the power of words. Those 12 words changed the world. You know, extraordinary to think that a scientific community can come to a finding and that finding can really have impact. So don't despair. I guess that's one message. The words that we have really can change the world. Another lesson was the importance of not doing science by eminence of position. It's all natural. It's all the sun. You've heard all of these things. You know, John has spent much of his last couple of years dealing with those myths and misconceptions. And the tack we've taken is do the science necessary to address the criticism. That's the most effective way of doing things. We've spent 9 months now addressing Senator Cruz's data or dogma hearing, and the statement that he made in that hearing and in Late Night with Seth Meyers and on an NPR interview with Steve Inskeep, satellite data show no significant warming over the last 18 years. That's demonstrably incorrect. You can show with some effort that that's incorrect. The challenge is this asymmetry. It's so easy to put these untruths out there in the world, yet the time scale for rebutting this stuff is much, much longer. And so few people pay attention to it. It's the initial untruth that gets all the attention. How do we change that? What I want is opportunities. You know, in the last 4 or 5 years in particular, I've tried hard not just to speak to my peers, but to speak to people who are skeptical about me and everything that my colleagues and I do. Bohemian Grove, Pacific Club, the Jonathan Club in LA. That was an interesting one. They polled the audience at the start of the presentation and asked how many people believe in climate change. And in an audience of 250 people, less than a handful of hands went up. But you give them pause for thought. What are the consequences for you and everything you hold dear of getting the science wrong on this one? And I want those opportunities. I want the films, and there are opportunities to do that, I believe. One of the extraordinary things that's going to happen in the next few years is somebody wants to make a major movie about what happened in Madrid 21 years ago, about the genesis of the balance of evidence statement, about the nature of the scientific evidence. How do we know? I want those opportunities. And I look forward to working together with all of you in the room and outside of the room to not screw those opportunities up, to make the best possible use of them.
In the movie business, we deal with really big ideas. So it has to be something that's really threatening the entire planet, or they're basically not interested. Okay. So obviously, we got that. Now, 2 of the movies that I created or helped to create were Outbreak and Armageddon. Outbreak is about a global pandemic. It's actually a pretty good movie. It's got Dustin Hoffman and Kevin Spacey and Morgan Freeman and some other great actors. You guys should see it if you haven't seen it already. And then the second movie I made a few years later, or helped to create a few years later, was Armageddon. That one kind of went off the rails, pretty far removed from what I had tried to create. When I start to work on a project, I always ask myself, what would really happen? And so I want to talk to people like you. I want to find, like when I was researching Armageddon, I went to talk to an astronomer at Harvard whose name was Brian Marsden. And he was the guy who actually tracks the orbital trajectories of new planetoids, okay? And I talked to him for 6 hours one day, and that was the most intense conversation I've probably ever had in my life. And he tried to tell me as much as he could in one afternoon about how that process goes forward. Well, I love that stuff, and I tried to put that in the screenplay. Unfortunately, they got a director named Michael Bay to do that one. And as you know, there wasn't a whole lot of science in Armageddon. But there was actually a little bit of science that survived in Outbreak. So I was pretty pleased with that. So for the last 10 years, I've been obsessed with climate change because clearly it's the same kind of threat. The problem, and Mike Roddy is the one who actually got me interested. Mike Roddy gave me a book to read about 10 years ago called 6 Degrees, I think it was. It was a fascinating book. Some of you guys have read it. You're nodding. Okay. And since then, I've probably read a dozen other books. I was also very influenced by Al Gore's documentary, Inconvenient Truth, which had an impact on me. And I kept searching and searching and searching for a way to dramatize the problem of climate change in a compelling way. The problem is that in a movie, you got to have a disaster that's happening right now. It can't take 50 years. That's not a movie. That's something else. And so what I'm doing now is actually something else. I've decided you simply cannot dramatize this. I wrote one screenplay called The First Wave, which was about a sudden disaster. It was about the notion that the Greenland ice sheet slides off the Greenland continent, Greenland island, overnight. It happens like that, and it creates a huge wave. And of course, all the scientists say, well, it couldn't slide off overnight. And I said, yeah, but this is a movie. Okay. So it slides off overnight, and there's this huge wave that comes down and basically inundates the entire city of Boston out to Route 128. And 300,000 people die in about 15 minutes. That's bad. That gets the people's attention because the wave doesn't stop there. It's going to keep going south, and eventually it's going to hit South Florida. And everybody knows what's going to happen to South Florida. So I thought, well, this is kind of a cheat because I'm using a premise that's not totally believable, but nevertheless, it does dramatize what will really happen in the end, probably long after we're gone. South Florida will be gone. The Texas coastal plain will be gone. New York City will be gone. Washington, D.C. will be gone. It'll be a scuba park, perhaps. They'll visit, we'll go visit the Jefferson Memorial with scuba gear on. And, we'll go visit the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia with scuba gear on. And the Central Valley of California will be flooded all the way up to, I forget where exactly, but near Fresno. It'll be badly flooded. Anyway, that stuff all takes time. It's going to take years and years and years. So what I'm doing now is a little different. And I'm trying to use the time in my favor. So I'm writing a novel instead of a movie, so that we can have the passage of time and actually show the incredible disasters that I think will actually unfold in this century. I don't think it's going to take 200 years or 300 years. I think we're on a path now to where if we don't turn around, we're in deep doo-doo by the end of this century. And my kids will still be alive, and a lot of your kids will still be alive. So hopefully get something done before too long. Thanks.
I have to say thank you to everyone in this room. I have been following the internet since the beginning of the internet and looking for all the content that is available on the internet, and it's exploded exponentially. It's just amazing. Peter Sinclair, thank you so much. It's just amazing. My education comes from watching your videos that are still really valid and really strong. So thank you. Now, I have a mailing list that I help with politicians. I adopt writers. I try to inform them. I have a ranting website called Climate Manifesto that I wrote just so that I could get the stuff out there in case I died tomorrow. Basically, I found out that I'm an eco-totalitarian. I think that, we need to go to zero carbon right now, and we need somebody to enforce it. I have coffee with old folks, and they are waiting for the Pearl Harbor moment, and they know that the transformation that happened after Pearl Harbor was so phenomenal. Someone worked at Boeing, and their dad was involved in the B-17 project. Took 1 month to build a B-17. When the war started, it cranked up, and it topped out at 16 B-17s per day. Now, there's no problem. I think what happened, if we reverse engineer what's going on with the oil industry, in the middle 80s, they realized, well, we really should stop all carbon right away, so we have to promote it as much as we can. We really should have stopped all carbon at that time. And I think we should do that now. Now, I don't want to, well, maybe I'll be the one to martyr myself on that, but I'd like to wait a little longer and have a little more fun in my life. One of the things I'm doing that I really enjoy is I collect metaphors. So part of my climate education was I lived next door to Ed Sarachik, who wrote a textbook on Pacific Decadal Oscillations. And he walked his dog, and I'd walk with him, and it took an hour and a half to walk the dog. And I'd ask him questions, and he said, well, no, you can't. I'm not going to tell you what the answer to that is until you do a little bit of reading. So Tragedy of the Commons was my first assignment. Well, everything just kind of comes out of that. So I started collecting metaphors, and my own metaphors that I reached out for were the sinking the Titanic, okay, or Moby Dick or something like that. And then I found out that there's this Norwegian philosopher who says, oh no, Titanic is a great metaphor, but we're in the lifeboats now. We just don't realize we're in the lifeboats. And I collected funny metaphors like, oh, we've fallen out of the airplane, we have to knit a parachute on the way down. We're in free fall because we haven't hit the ground yet and we think we've gotten away with it. Then I thought, well, maybe geological time, we're in a car crash, a slow car crash. Instead of taking a second, it's taking 50 or 100 years. Only we don't know how much control we have over the steering. Maybe we've run off the road, and we don't know if we're going to go bashing through the woods and hit something or if we're going to get out of it. We've got 6 billion people in our car. So Ed Sarachik, I asked him and I said, what is your metaphor? And he said, he thought that we were in a giant boat in a vast river floating downstream. And it's very pleasant. And we see on the horizon there's mist rising, and we hear a roar of a waterfall. We can't really see it. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we know we have to go upstream. And we can't get people involved to make that change. So please tell me what your metaphors are. I'm sure, because what I think has to happen, there has to be a cognitive change as to what we're doing and where we stand in our world. And my latest one is, I think that we are much like the cancer patient in stage 4 condition. Now, stage 4 does not mean death, or it just means that there has to be that there's a metastasis going on, and there has to be outside active treatment of the patient. And what we have now is we have a medical crew that says, oh, we know what we have to do, and let's get going, let's treat the patient. But all of a sudden, we got a new regime here where a different doctor's come in who's a total quack. And we got 4 years in which our stage 4 patient will not be able to receive proper treatment. So the reason I collect these things is because I think that's an important reason for cognitively looking at our situation, because we live in a time now, unlike all of times in history, that we can sort of predict the future. No one could do that before. It's like we always knew that before, winter, summer, spring, and fall. But now we know things are going to be different, and that's totally uncharted territory. So please, when you talk amongst yourselves, talk about that and let me know what you say. Okay. If you have any ideas on that, let me know.
We started in Beijing, and now we're on 5 continents, and we work with students around the world who are roughly 12 to 18. That said, that once they've worked with our organization, they tend to want to stay involved, because the empowerment and the things that they took on and felt good about taking on has allowed them to have so much efficacy and want to continue. So it's one of the things that I'd like to talk about, is that I really would like to put in a pitch that I have a card and you can read more about what we do, but we'd like to get you involved more with students of that age. I think you'll be really delighted to see what they bring to the table, and they will learn so much from you by being seen as a peer, by you involving them in your projects and listening to their point of view. Many people they bring a new perspective, some new solutions that we hadn't thought about. And every day, I think I know some of the people that brought that case. The guy from Earth Guardians, he's an amazing speaker. He spoke at Paris. We've had conferences both in COP21 and COP22 with students from around the world. But students are really stepping up. And the students we work with, as I listen to everybody talking, they seem to really grasp that this is their future. And they know that. And so they're asking questions, they're looking for information. And I feel like when I was listening to everything people said, they're pretty good at sniffing out where the truth lies. And they're very good at knowing what's in their future and coming up with ideas to solve those problems. We have materials on our website which ask kids to think about what you're passionate about. There's a lot of very positive research about that now. If it's something you're passionate about, you're going to stay involved, you're going to just work from sun up till sundown on it, and that's what these kids are doing. And they feel so good about what they're involved in. They have teams of kids. They then, after they've come up with some solutions, they create a film. They come to conferences we have around the world, we just had one in Marrakesh. We then had one in Quito. We're having one in Panama. And so coming to that conference are going to be kids who've all created a project which actually addressed a global issue and has had an impact. And that is something they really are proud of. But also when you have 300 or 400 kids in a room who said, oh, well, I did that, but not in like a bragging way. It's like a way like, well, if you can do it, I can do it. It's energizing, and I think that's a bit of what you felt. I was so glad that Salesh was in Marrakesh when I was there, and I asked him, and he came over and did a speech or a keynote at the conference that we had at the American School of Marrakesh. I actually lived in Morocco for 9 years, so the idea of going there and bringing the conference that we've been growing and the kids and the ethos we've been growing to that country was really very important to me. My kids feel like they were raised there. But I think you felt a very positive energy. Richard also attended the conference we had in this Seattle, Washington, at a school that was really a terrific school. And again, you really shared some feeling of hope, and you could tell that the kids had this confidence, and I don't think it's well-founded that they can do this. And so what I'm hoping, my points of action are that anytime you can, step back and think, is there a way I could involve more young people? Maybe we have a mentorship program that's on our website. So if you give me your name and say, I could be a mentor, we're going to find somebody around the world. Maybe it's 3 or 4 kids. Ashley works with 5 gin-turns. 3 are from Brazil, 1 is from Panama, and the other one is from, but anyway, it's like Peru. So, that's the 5 kids that meet with her once or twice a week, and they've been planning courses. They've taught kids a virtual program around the world on how to be a global ambassador to grow our program in their schools, because we don't want it to be adult-driven. We want it to be student-driven. And kids realize that we really respect what they're doing and their ability to do that. And that program now is in its first level, but it's going to double, triple. We're really looking at exponential growth because we feel we owe this to these kids. They can't get enough of having these real-world chances to get involved with you. We have a global network. Part of what Richard, who wrote High Noon, 20 Global Problems, 20 Years to Solve It, he had 2 basic premises, which we kind of started with, is that we ask that our students all consider themselves global citizens. And that really empowers them because, A, they know their local project has definitely global ramifications, which is really important to them. But it also, there's no national barriers. They just see that they all have common concerns that they're going to work on. The other thing was to create a network, which now, the book was written 16 years ago. The networks really work, and these kids now are in contact with people around the world that have similar problems. They're trying to see, well, you worked on that, the idea of how to save wood, all those things. We're trying to share as much as we can. So those are things. What I'd like to say to you is if you'll send us things that you think students, Richard's been very good to send me lots of information that I try to share with kids when, when they're asking questions about this. But if there's things that you think kids, not if you think, there's a lot of things that you know about and could share with us that we'd like to share with kids, and they will benefit from knowing about it. And I think sometimes we even underestimate what their interest level is. The other thing we've discovered, which I think has been a bonus, is we've also discovered that when kids, young people, feel strongly about something, their parents actually listen to what they're saying. Oh, maybe I'll quit using plastic bags. I mean, the kids can get the parents to do it. Things we try up and down, all these different things, parents, and I'm not trying to be unfair to parents, but we found that the kids are really good at getting people to make changes in their lives. And also, we found that age child is absolutely idolized by younger children. So, like my grandson had a kid come to his classroom and tell him about composting. He was out there, he was 4 years old. He was digging, I got to start composting because that kid told me I have to compost. And he's never going to forget that. So this age group is just magical. They want it, they know it, they're very capable, and they're finding, I mean, this guy that invented the plastic vacuum cleaner, I mean, they're coming up with all sorts of solutions that sometimes we just hadn't realized, and we definitely could benefit from working with them. So I'd like to offer you that we'll publish things on our network. I'd like to ask you to be mentors with some of these students, and I think whoever we partner you with, it'd be a neat interchange about what do you think about this as a 12-year-old, or what's on your mind. So those are things. And then I was speaking to Warren, we were talking about that we really would like to, I thought when I was asked to come up with action items to really make a difference, it seems to me there could be an open source curriculum, K to 12, that really would start giving kids some ideas of how they, that are age appropriate, that could be a global curriculum. We have kids around the world that could translate it into other languages. We work with international schools, that was our life, so we pretty much could get it translated into any language. And think how great it would be if there was this common platform that was available to everybody so they could start feeling like they were moving forward in mass. I feel it would provide them a lot of hope and even get them more energized to keep doing a lot of what they're doing. So, thank you.
Well, when Mike invited me to this event back in June, what I wanted to talk about back then was very different from what I think needs to be talked about today. Since the election, every day the situation has gotten progressively worse. I've rewritten these words continually. I was going to talk about technologies and policies that could help mitigate the worst aspects of abrupt climate change. But I don't think it makes sense to discuss solutions quite so enthusiastically in a political environment that's antithetical to this discussion. I've been thinking a lot about the famous quote from Pericles, the Athenian general and statesman who observed 2,500 years ago that just because you're not interested in politics doesn't mean that politics won't take an interest in you. Since November 8th, the focus now must be on resisting the rise of ultranationalism in the United States and abroad. Not just because white nationalism is morally odious, but because ultranationalists universally deny the science of climate change. We know that reducing humanity's carbon footprint requires a reliable international framework for cooperation, like the Paris Agreement. But ultranationalists will never participate in international agreements to reduce carbon emissions. Philippine strongman Rodrigo Duterte and Donald Trump both have indicated that their intent is to withdraw from the Paris Accord. The reactionary parties in Britain and France and Australia all deny climate science. We have a glimmer of hope in Austria, where the defeat of Hofer's Freedom Party happened recently, but they still got 46% of the vote, and so they're not going away. In the US, professional climate denialist Myron Ebell of CEI heads Trump's EPA transition team. Bob Walker, senior Trump advisor, says Trump will eliminate NASA's Earth science research programs. We've seen this happen already in Australia, where Malcolm Turnbull's government has defunded climate science at CSIRO. And they've approved the enormous Carmichael coal mine, so they're going to be exporting coal to India. Scott Pruitt, longtime enemy of the EPA, will head the EPA. And this morning, it was confirmed that ExxonMobil's CEO, Rex Tillerson, will be Secretary of State. And as a bonus, former Texas Governor Rick Perry will be the Energy Secretary. And yes. Oh, excellent. Well, that should be fun. He dances nicely. He's kind of entertaining to watch. He might be the most fun appointment in that gang. So it'd be hard to select a cabinet that's really more inimical to environmental and climate issues. So now the game is to prevent the advanced democracies from falling to ultranationalism. I'm not happy to report that our priority for the foreseeable future must be political activism. I hate politics. I would much rather be graphing environmental data in Excel. But in November, we saw neo-Nazis throwing fascist salutes in the Ronald Reagan building in Washington, D.C. So political activism must be our focus. Timothy Snyder, history professor at Yale University, has given us 20 points to guide our resistance to autocracy. I picked 2 to highlight tonight. Not all 20 are worth reading. First, defend an institution. Institutions can't defend themselves, and the Rex Putin-Trump axis is coming for science, especially climate science, evolutionary biology. Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, has signaled that he intends to take down the New York Times the same way Gawker was taken down. Also, the past must be rewritten to support reactionary mythologies, so history will be targeted. As Russian journalist Masha Gessen notes in her essay, Rules for Survival in an Autocracy, institutions are fragile. It took Putin a year to take over the Russian media and 4 years to dismantle its electoral system. So pick an institution and defend it. Subscribe to your favorite source of journalism with real cash money. A couple of months back, when I saw that the Washington Post was leading the charge against Trump, I subscribed. Second, practice corporeal politics. Professor Snyder says, power wants your body softening in your chair. It wants you dissipating your emotions on the computer screen. So make new friends with unfamiliar people. Go to unfamiliar places. Like this, march in the streets. And events like this can be a model for political participation and activism in the future. I was very heartened to hear 500 scientists today were out there protesting somewhere down there. That's very encouraging. In 2016, as Pericles warned, politics has taken an interest in us. And unfortunately, we have to take an interest in politics. Thank you very much.
Just 2 minutes. I want to just give you a quick report from flyover country, from Michigan in the Rust Belt, which was so pivotal in this election. I would have bet any money that Michigan would not have gone for Trump. I still believe that it did not go to Trump for a variety of reasons. But I have been spending the last few weeks meeting with citizens who are activated, and there's a couple of points that I make is that everyone I talk to that pays attention, that knows what's going on, it's like they have a similar complex of symptoms. They say, I can't eat, I can't sleep, I feel like someone kicked me in the stomach, and I feel like somebody died. And it's so consistent and so common throughout the whole strata that I feel that this is evidence of an enormous amount of human energy that has been activated by the events. And in the spirit of not letting a good crisis go to waste, what we're doing is probably something that we would have had to do anyway had Hillary been elected, but maybe would not have had that kick in the pants and energy to do it. And that is, we were still going to have a problem, a bottleneck in Washington, even with Hillary as president. And so the only way forward is to go deeply, deeply local. So the watchwords I'm giving are local, vocal, and don't back down. And the encouragement that I'm giving to people is once you activate yourself and make up your mind and you take decisive action, then you, if even just for a microsecond, become the focal point that the universe turns on. My parents taught me that someone like Trump may think that because he's the president that he has all the power. But in the United States of America, the highest constitutionally defined office, in my mind, is not a congressman, a senator, or even the president. It is the citizen. And that's all of us. So Mr. Trump thinks he has the power. Mr. Putin thinks he has the power. They have not seen power. We're going to educate the world about what power is, and we're going to bring it to them, and we're going to bring it to them in the new year. And I'm so happy to be here, and I'm happy to chat with anybody that wants to expand on the ideas that we've talked about tonight. So thanks a whole lot.